Afternoon, folks. Or good morning, depending on your disposition. Am I audible? Okay, I'm assuming you can hear me, guys. If you can't, let me know. So I didn't have an agenda this week. I went into Slack. I was going to propose to cancel due to I've been off for most of the week. But I noticed Tal and Tim had a discussion ongoing in the modeling chat about the level of detail that we want to get into and different approaches. So I don't know if this is something we want to take in this meeting, or if anybody has anything else they want to bring. My comment really is I have not progressed much further with the documenting the taking the existing documents that we spoke about last week and converting them into the Git repo. So that was my position. Any thoughts?
Well, I posted it on Slack exactly because I didn't think it should be in the meeting, at least not yet. I think what women are talking about is a little bit too low level. It's not very critical right now. Yeah, sorry if it was a distraction.
No, that's fine. I see your last comment was if there's interest, I can delve into the design issues in a modeling meeting. So I assume that was a request to discuss
No,
in.
no. It was an honest question. If there's interest, my suspicion is that it is too low level, but it is in the scope generally of this meeting. But I just feel like it's probably a lower priority. Like if aspects of ports change, I think what we're hoping for is that it won't change our basic models. We don't want to be dependent on the implementation. Right, I imagine so. There are sometimes advantages of working very closely with an implementation, but I think in our case, it seems that we have a smaller meeting today, but I think most participants here come from a telco background and are interested in aligning with the technology and the use cases, not necessarily with a specific tool that we're using, right? If that makes sense. I might be making a lot of assumptions here, so people can disagree. Silence is agreement.
Yeah, I think one of the purposes that I was hoping to get out of this sort of initial meeting series was that we baseline what we have, and then we use that as a means to kind of evolve to where we want to be. I felt that what you were discussing was what we want to model or what we want to expose as our models should be a more higher level abstraction than we currently have. I'm not entirely sure whether I read that correctly or not. But you want to basically rejig the models that we have in some way to improve how they interact and so on. I thought that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I do want to do that. I mean, there's a lot of cleanups I want to do in various parts of Nephew, but it's a matter of priority. I think, I just posted on something I've been working on, but I think it's a lower priority for this group, in my opinion.
Okay, well, in that case, I don't have anything else to put on an agenda for this meeting. If anybody else doesn't have a discussion point or something to bring up, then I'm going to propose that I can spend the time working on some of that modeling.
That works. I guess maybe we can discuss together who's here, what our next steps really are. What is the next big thing that we want to tackle? Um, so working on the models, but is there a specific aspect of the models, Kieran, that you think to do?
What I can do is I can throw up a Word document and we can kind of jot down a few notes on that. That's a good
Okay.
I think I did have a similar sort of workflow at some point, but I'll start something new just for the crack. Bear with me. I'll share my screen. Let me know if you can see that.
Yep.
I don't know what happens if I click this, but that's what happens. Okay, so my view was the first thing we work on is baselining at an agreed level of accuracy. What we have currently modeled in the Nephew implementation. And a lot of the discussions over the last while have been around what is an agreed level of accuracy and how close to the code do we want to be in terms of getting that information out. And I think some of the other discussions have been around once we have that baseline, how do we evolve the models forward? And the discussions there have been around things like standards alignment. Design first. So to design the models / APIs before development or not, depending on your perspective. And standards alignment or not as well, depending on your perspective. I think there are different schools of thought on both of those. So I can actually put question marks in those. And then I think, go ahead.
I would add use case alignment as well. So designing them closely, yeah, you can say driven by use case. If we're unable to express our use cases clearly and usefully for architects, then we failed, right? Because we start with our own use cases.
Yeah, and I guess taking that a bit further, you're probably sort of saying, if I have taking an ORAN alignment use case, for example, if I'm creating a cluster, then that might involve creating a package variant or onboarding a package, creating a package variant, et cetera, and interacting with the various different modeled entities that are required in order to do so.
Right. This is about the contents of the package, right? Things like if we're modeling a network, right? This is where we get into network architecture, right? But it's not just network architecture, it's also infrastructure. So if we can express our use cases usefully, then we win, right? I think it's not only the deciding on the baseline of our accuracy, but also kind of the standard, the success standard for us, right? When is a model successful or not? To an extent, even bad models can be workable, right? We've all worked with such systems, right? Where you work with what you have and you make it work. So there's a success standard of it works, but there's a success standard of it's working well and useful for us scalability moving forward. So I think we need to kind of agree on right what we're trying to achieve in that regard. Yeah, Wim, go ahead. You probably want to respond.
No, not to this in general. I think what so we have to align with standards, but we also have to be sometimes standard agnostic. To give an example, what I was trying to say, like in O-RAN right now, they are trying, so they have a cluster management. In my view, it should not be part of O-RAN, but we will not be able to change it. But there can be very specific things that they are asking, which I believe we should not necessarily have to follow. Because so there is, I think 3GPP and all these parameters is a different thing, but there are certain, let's say a cluster create, let's say take cluster creation as an example, right? We should make this as generic as we can and not be following specifically O-RAN's case, because O-RAN is a specific implementation. To give you an example of what standard alignment, I'm mainly commenting on standard alignment. We have to do that in a smart way. That doesn't mean we align with the standard. We make the standard work within a framework that allows for more general consumption.
Right. I think this is why there's a question mark there. I think I'm agreeing 100% with you. I think alignment, to me, that's a very strong word. I would prefer something like compatibility or convergence or integration. I think if we can work with the standards, that's our goal. Aligning with the standards, in my opinion, should not be our goal. That's why I mentioned driven by use cases, right? I think that's our goal. We're practically minded, right? We want to achieve actual things that the industry desires, actual use cases. This is why we work so hard on developing our use cases. So in my view, those should be king, and standards are to an extent secondary. We do need compliance with them, but alignment, as I said, is far too strong, right?
Compatible or something like that. We should be able to be compatible with it or something like that is what I.
Right, compliance, yeah, compliance is even too far because there might actually be an official compliance, and we don't know about that quite yet, right?
So can I, sorry, Tim has a hand up, and Jean-Marie, and then maybe I'll put my hand up as well. Can I do that?
Yeah, you are the moderator, so your hand is up anyhow, in my view. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Go ahead, Karen. You're the mic. Wim's right. Your hand's always up.
Okay. No, I'll actually let you and Jean-Marie have your say, and then I'll go because.
So I agree with what Wim's saying, but we got to realize, and I'm going to use the cluster component as an example, right? The creation of the cluster is we have to be able to support or interop or be compatible with. I don't care what the word is, right? When you said standards alignment, that's what I was assuming, was that I have to be able to take what O-RAN has done with the cluster, and I have to be able to realize that or utilize NEPIO and the NEPIO aspect. If they are so dissimilar that I can't do that, we fail, right? Because it can't be used by O-RAN. Okay, and so yeah, I have it's a concern of mine that when we develop our models, that the models are usable by the associated by the interested organizations who are our audience, right? And I do agree that you just don't want to take O-RAN's say cluster, because how that may very well have not be interoperable or compatible with the automotive industry, because they're not even considering that, right? And we're considering a more broader piece. So I tend to agree with what you're saying. I was less worried about the word alignment there, but whatever we do has to work within our customer base, right? Which is right now only telco. Hopefully it'll be different down the road.
Yeah, that's why I would, sorry to chime in, but but I would not say standard compliant. I would say compatible with the standard is, I think, a better way, or at least that's how I think about it.
So I changed it to interoperability / compatibility with standards compliant systems. I'm still leaving the question mark up there because I do think we have got different levels of ambition here. And I think just to comment on Tim's point, if we don't become ORAN compliant, then we have failed. Or does that mean that ORAN have failed because they didn't meet the NEFIO or take the NEFIO approach? Or
if I
or
use,
we failed as an industry,
no.
or
If I use the word compliant in the sense, I got to remember who's in the audience, right? So what I always say is that if I cannot utilize the NEFIO, we're talking about clusters, for example, right? Creation of clusters. If I can't utilize the NEFIO enablers for within ORAN, within the ORAN context of that, integrate the ORAN pieces using the NEFIO enablers, we as NEFIO have failed, right? Because we're trying to provide a system that can be used, a Swiss Army knife that can be used within ORAN, right? And particularly since we know kind of what ORAN is that those groups are doing, and we're working closely with them. If at the end of this thing, and you know, Kyle talks about it as use case driven, right? At the end of it, this thing, if I can't integrate ORAN onto NEFIO, NEFIO failed, right?
My counterpoint to that would be one of the things that I think, I mean, maybe I'm on my own in this, but I think one of the goals of sort of bringing in cloud technologies into telco is to leverage what's happening in a broader industry outside of the telco environment, leveraging the strong capabilities that are coming out of the IT sector and bringing them into telco. And so that's where I would question if what we're doing in NEFIO is good enough for a sort of types of workload that we are, and we create a capability that is good enough and we're successful in doing that, then there's a certain amount of is it incumbent on ORAN to align with NEFIO and to sort of push it that way, or is it incumbent the other way around that NEFIO should strive to be compliant?
Well, I'm saying that in this case, if ORAN can't use the cluster, for example, just use an example of the cluster. If ORAN cannot use the cluster enablers provided by NEFIO, and they have to go do it themselves, and then what other customers are going to do that? What other customers can really utilize that? Maybe there are other customers that you can't, and 9 of the 10 work, but ORAN doesn't, right? I'm just saying, and I guess it's driven by the use cases and our people that are vested in NEFIO, right? That's all I'm saying is that, ORAN may very well, the ORAN team may very well look at that and say, yeah, I'm not going to use the NEFIO stuff. And then what are you doing? You just built something that no one uses. So, that's what I was trying to try that.
Okay, Jean-Marie, sorry, you've had your hand up a good while. So
yeah, no worry. The flow of conversation was better not being interrupted. So, and I basically wanted to concur. First, ORAN is not the only part. Okay, and the network is not only constituted of the RAN, and I'm not aware that NEFIO intends only to address the RAN. So yes, we need to be usable, and ideally it should be possible to implement a no-RAN cluster using NEFIO, but I don't think, like the majority of the people there, that the very definition of that ORAN could be half of a cluster, and we can debate whether ORAN should define one or not, should not dictate what is our definition of a cluster in NEFIO, because, as I was saying, I believe the applicability and the scope of NEFIO is just beyond the RAN.
Well, I did not. I was using ORAN and clusters as an example. NEFIO has certain audiences, whether it's core, most of them are telco, as Tal was saying, right? But there's audiences that we're customers that we're concerned about, that are engaged with us. ORAN is one. WIM's here for fixed line uncertain. But it's all telco related. There's some people here for core, the whole bit, right? If we're not building enablers that they can use within their systems, right? Then that's what I'm saying, is that we will fail because people won't use it, right? And maybe 9 of the 10, or maybe we have 10 people that, or 10 organizations or communities, other communities that are using Nepio enablers, and 9 of the 10 use the cluster, maybe ORAN can't. That doesn't mean that we failed. It means that 9 of the 10 did it. We could not accommodate those 9 and Nepio, right? So my point is that we gotta look at what our customers are doing. If we just do enablers that aren't going to be used, then we failed in our job.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. That means yeah. Sorry, I'm jumping. But
yeah, no, you had your hand up. I was just about to.
Yeah. So I think we are. Yeah. See, what I was going to say was the following, right? So just to make it concrete, because that's a discussion we have on cluster, for example. I was not there this week, so I don't know what we discussed. But I think last week it was clear that we need a reference to a template. Okay. We typically do that with group version kind, namespace name, right? Which is the Kubernetes way. All-round, they want to be not only doing Nepio, but others, right? So they want to basically have a reference, which means whatever what, right? So I think we kind of converge to the fact, okay, let's use a string that we can interpret in either way. So in other words, we are accommodating both sides, right? Which is basically what we should do, I think, right? And not only do the Nepio way and not only do the ORAN way, but because I think ORAN at the moment is also not yet defined what a cluster is. So they are also still figuring out what they should do. So from that perspective, I think we are trying to align. So we are not, what I'm trying to say.
I like the way the cluster stuff is being done, Wim, by the way,
so
because we're making a win-win situation. That's all we're trying to do with all our customers. So, we're doing win-win, right? So
So, and in other words, I think we are pretty close to alignment, I think, from my perspective. I mean, if we have a few more discussions around it. So it's also not, we should not be, what I'm saying, it's not only the Nepio way either, right? So we should be open-minded on what we see across the globe, right? Or across the world. But it's like we were discussing, it's around, there is more than all around, right? Because Nepio tries to be also doing the core in particularly, or other use cases, versus the round should also take a look at how other people are doing things. So, which is, I think, what we are doing. So in other words, I don't think there's a problem here. And at the moment, we have been trying to build things so far in a very open manner, right? So if you look, for example, the discussion that we had at some point on 3GPP, right? So at some point we were trying to model very specific stuff. We decided not to do so and build a container that can be used as an aggregate, which is a way to accommodate for flexibility, right? So I think that's what we within Nepio should do is maximize for flexibility. I think that will be means that we have the success. So I believe if I would add one bullet is maximize flexibility in terms of modeling. And try to be less prescriptive as we can.
And then you're also saying allow SDOs to specialize according to their needs.
Yes, yeah, correct. Because it doesn't really matter if you use a Yang for 3GPP or a Yang for fixed networks. For us, we shouldn't really care about it.
Yeah, I think at that level, that makes sense. I think things like, I mean, if you're talking, there was some discussion about, bringing GitOps into ORAN, I think on the Slack channel. I was just trying to find it there between Alexei and a couple of others. And I think that might have been what you were referring to, Tim. So for example, you could have an IMS on the ORAN architecture, you could have an IMS which is implemented by Nefio in vendor 1, and in vendor 2 it could be implemented by something specific and proprietary to them. And that's where the standards try and remain agnostic of the underlying implementation, and they wouldn't be talking about persistence technologies like Git, but you might sort of say the semantics of handling package orchestration as we specify through ports, or as we want to specify through future version supports, would be something that would make sense to propose to us an SDO. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and then each SDO could deliver their own packages that are specialized to a particular need or whatever. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, no, I think you got it. Certainly, and I can only speak for the ORAN team on this one, but you know, they're more than willing, you know, the audience there to try to bring things back into those standards organizations. We've always had that loop, feedback loop, right? So, but yeah, there's going to be patterns that may very well, or processes that may very well that will feed back into the standards. I think people are fully open to that and trying to make that happen. But it's for that, in order to obtain that win-win scenario, right? We need the win-win.
Yeah.
So
Tim, Charles, sorry, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's okay. So kind of on this, I think again, I think we need maybe a new bullet point here on. We need as a group to decide what our success criteria are, and the reason is that we can achieve all of these goals mentioned here with bad models, right? We can be aligned with ORAN with bad models. We can be flexible with bad models, right? There's no statement here of the quality of our work, right? And I think we need some sort of quality criteria, right? And that is not just use case driven, but also role driven, right? Because if at the end of the day we say we want human architects to be able to use these models to develop blueprints and deployments and sites and all that, or not, right? If we're saying no, these are just low level building blocks that some automation system will use. So that's where the design has to be focused, right? I don't think that's clear for all of us, right? We've talked a little bit about human versus machine. AI, you know, can join here as well. Are these models easily generated by an AI? Is that a goal that we want to pursue? So I don't have necessarily answers for all of this. I think as a community, we need to decide you know, what these models are for and how good they should be for the roles that they fulfill, right? Because we can achieve all of the above. I would even argue that we already do, right? I think our building blocks so far have been agnostic and low level for the most part. There might be little things about networking that we can tweak, but do we really just want to tweak things so that they can work? Or do we want to achieve a kind of comprehensive philosophy paradigm that that human architects can use productively, right? And that's where questions of scalability come in. In terms of, okay, we now have 1 million blueprints or something like that go to various sites. Can modeling help us manage them at a large scale, right? Or is that even a goal? Right? Is that a fleeting goal that we don't have to care about too much? Are we more interested in the technical building blocks to make sure that they basically work? So yeah, to me, this is an open question. I don't have a strong idea on what we should do. Tim, is your hand still up from before, or do you want to jump in?
No, sorry, I meant to lower it.
No problem. Yeah.
I think those are very valid points in terms of quality. I think that's what you mean by quality. Sorry, I need to mute because of my fire alarm. So the fire alarm goes off here at 3:30 in the afternoon every Friday. So
If I
go ahead, Jean-Marie.
If I may intervene here, I see a relationship with our previous discussion, because I would propose that one criteria to judge the quality of our model is whether when we need to adapt or we need to implement those different SDOs, but I know it's a bit of an abuse of language, whether the specificities are confined or whether they are pervasive, and the difference between, let's say, an ORAN cluster versus another cluster defined by another organization, is the difference confined in a few objects or a few concepts of the model, or is it touching everywhere in the model? And to me, one state is more desirable than the other.
So is that like, do we know the touch points between what is in the standard are, there's a lot of touch points, or there's not a lot of overlap? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and to me, that's how do we achieve good quality? Is the implementation of using nephew of an ORAN cluster and another defined cluster? Is it a big difference, or is it or is the difference concentrated into a few concepts?
Okay.
And that's not so much about are they completely aligned, but is our model robust to changes and different requirements or not?
Now, yeah.
Flexible maybe is what we're.
I mean, so yeah, if I may, so far we haven't done a bad job, I think, because if you look to when we onboarded all-round or the radio components from OAI on top of the core, okay, we added the flexibility for the config, right? But that was because we didn't do it in R1. And so we now have an ability to basically add any config to any platform. So I think so far in terms of flexibility, we are so far achieving our goal. I have, for example, onboarded fixed side of the house. I didn't have to change anything on the model, which means that we are not specific either towards the 5G side, so it's also flexible towards other use cases. I'm not saying everyone, but at least some. That's my current perspective on the situation. I don't know whether people disagree.
I agree that we're already very flexible. My question is, are there other criteria that we want? Yeah. I think, for example, we're not very coherent in my view. So that's the question. If we're evolving towards something, and we want to evolve what we have, then the question is, what's the purpose of that evolution, right? What other qualities are we trying to achieve? So what qualifies as good, right? So flexibility is one component of being good, but the question is, are there others as well?
Yeah, and basically my proposal was how much that flexibility is costing. So is that flexibility concentrated on some a limited set of concepts and classes in our model that leave the rest intact, or is it pervasive and you need to touch every single artifact to move from one to the other?
Right. A good question is, what are the trade-offs of our current model, right? So you can imagine flexibility being on a spectrum with highly opinionated right? So on the one hand, you have very flexible, and on the other hand, very opinionated. Although I would argue that it's not always either or, right? I think you can be both flexible and opinionated. So yeah, these are open questions, right? I don't have an answer.
I mean, I guess you could argue, I'm hearing a sort of a Venn diagram or visualizing a Venn diagram in my head when I hear this discussion in terms of, is an SDO defined capability a subset of a Nephio capability so it can be fully encapsulated using Nephio's flexibility? Or is there an overlap where some stuff is beyond what Nephio does and some stuff is within it? Or is a one-to-one mapping, I guess, that's the kind of the three possible options I see in my head. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would add another thing here. It touches a little bit on the Slack discussion I started, right? So in a sense, I'm strongly agreeing with Wim on the idea that if we have very basic building blocks, then we can build anything, right? So our basic building block is a package, right? So for example, I say, well, templates, or let's call them blueprints versus deployments, are both packages. So if we have just the lower level idea of a package, then we can do the other two, right? But I'm inspired in a way by languages like Tosca. I know not everybody likes it, but the idea of Tosca that it's object oriented, right? So you can have a basic classes of things, but then you can inherit classes and create things that are more use case specific based on those like lower level building blocks. There are also, you can create assemblages of capabilities. Those are other things that Tosca lets you do. But we haven't really thought of our models in that way because KRM doesn't really encourage that way of thinking, right? It's not object oriented. But, you know, in our modeling, of course, we can do that, right? Because we have that flexibility. So we could, for example, create some sort of idea of assemblages that take our basic building blocks and you know, represent something a bit higher level than that, right? We can't do inheritance exactly, but we can be inspired by that idea and create something, right? So yeah, that's why I'm saying that, you know, flexibility is not an obstacle for strong models, but yeah, it's not necessarily either or, right? But again, it's about having a very good design that I think lets you not only technically achieve use cases, but also do them in an intuitive way that maps very easily to higher level orchestration constructs.
Did I capture what you're trying to say there?
Difficult practically.
So
Yeah. I mean, we're kind of spitballing here, right? Brainstorming. So no, this is great. I mean, if we can distill this later into something that's more a mission statement for us as a group, that would help. Yeah. But
I think we also need to figure out how we can get to answering some of the questions
Right.
and sort of set a set of principles around this. So,
yeah.
and I don't know whether that needs to be brought to, for example, the SIG network architecture, but we can discuss that later once we sort of distill what the questions are. Then we can. And it's a good discussion, and it's something I've been thinking about in my head, but I haven't actually written anything down. So thanks for triggering the conversation. Then you have your hand back up again, so I'm assuming that's.
No, I had a small. Just to give you a context, right? I think you can do inheritance in KRM, in my view, but the question is that do we want, right? Because I take an example, what we did where we decided not to do so, right? So take NF deployments. In the beginning, we had SMF deployment, UPF deployment, AMF deployment. We could have done run or CU, DU, blah, blah, blah. We could have inherited the base component and reused it in other places, right? But we ended up having to define a gazillion network functions, and for every network function type, we had to have its own definition, right? Or at least inherit the base and then augment it and stuff like that. So you can do that. And I think we made a decision not to do so, right? Because then I'm more flexible. So we have the choice. I mean, it's a choice we have in modeling to decide what we want to do and what are the consequences, right? And I think that's one of the things that we should document then, why we ended up in a certain direction and why we go into a certain direction, and why in Nephew we decided to go that way. But you always have people that have better taste for A versus B, right? So you probably will never be able to please them all. And I think at the moment, Nephew is about doing a reference thing. That doesn't mean that people cannot do the other taste that other people could have, right? So we are just doing a way. And of course, we should do it in a way that we want others to follow, but nobody is, let's say, linked or limited towards what we do inside of Nephew, right? So you can have people can change if they want.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say, I don't know if you can see my screen when it changes, if you're actually looking at the UPF reconciler and all that stuff. I think that's what you're referring to, isn't it, Vin?
Yeah, I mean, that's a case where we could have gone, right, with a set of inheritance type of mode of operation. So you could do it because you can basically inherit a base definition and then augment it. But we decided not to do so. And my point is to tell is we can, there is inheritance inside of KRM if you want. Question is whether we want or not.
Yeah,
of course
I don't necessarily want. I would say that in the Tosca world, I argue against. I tried to make Tosca 2.0 not have inheritance because I think assemblages are more powerful, right? If you compare, for example, how the Go language, right? I think in our world, because, I think inheritance is usually singular inheritance rather than multiple inheritance. So I don't think inheritance is necessarily the best. It's more about reusability and creating higher level objects, which I think you can do in other ways, not necessarily inheritance. But I guess my point is this, right? When we have, the trade-off to me is this: if we have very powerful and flexible low level models, they're hard to comprehend, right? I don't think a lot of users of Nephio, I think, are sometimes confused by how many object types we have and how they all work together, right? You have to start building diagrams to show how you can build these concepts together. So my thinking is that if you have some reusability, you can create higher level models that still have the power of the lower level models, but are more, again, usable for humans, right? For an architect to put things together. Think of a Lego set. You can give somebody a box of Lego blocks and say, well, with this, you can build anything you want. That's great. And that's true. But you have to be kind of a very creative and high level person to be able to build everything. Whereas if you have blocks that are already composed of other blocks and are already immediately usable, that could be more powerful, right? And more usable. But again, it's our success criteria, right? What trade-offs are we willing to accept? And I think we can do both, but we haven't done both. So again, as you said, when we have the potential to do higher level models, but we haven't done it. And the question is, should we do it? And should this group be the one that kind of drives how those models would look like? If you're sitting in this network architecture seat.
Jean-Marie?
Yeah, so it's a slight tangent, but related. So we say KRM does not really support inheritance, and the way it has been we've been going in Nephio currently is not using inheritance, but using reference. Isn't it a case of using the decorator pattern instead of the inheritance pattern?
I mean, I think we should say, what I'm trying to say is that I think KRM allows for inheritance if you want. You have to design for it, right? So it's not that it doesn't support it. It just whether we want and how we would like it to use and stuff like that, right? Because at the moment we have tried to build generalized building blocks. That's kind of what we have been doing so far, in my view, with the goal to be flexible, right? Now, it's true what Tal says. That means NF deployment. For me, I would even say that it's an app. I would not even say it's a network function. In my personal world, I would not even call a network function because at the end of the day, it's an application you deploy. And
or it's a workload.
Yeah, it should be workload.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, it's actually end of the day, it's an app, right? Because there's no difference actually. In essence, there is no difference, and maybe that's a very debatable. In my view, there's no difference between deploying a UPF than cert manager.
In terms of the, yeah, I think that's down to semantics, but in my view, you could have an app. An app generally provides some set of capability, which might be network function related, or it might be, you know, I don't know, like a shopping cart or something like that. What was the example you gave him of the other?
Cert
Cert
manager I
manager.
gave as an example, but yeah, so cert manager has other characteristics. We are very, I would say that network functions are very infra heavy, right? So we are very dependent on infra demand, but which the others don't necessarily have. But I would call them all application or workloads or whatever. But okay, that's a different conversation. But that means that because we already, our terminology is a network function. That means that we already bias towards that, right? Whereas if you talk to an IT guy and we say a network function, they ask you the question, what is this?
Yeah.
And in essence, there is no difference, in my view, between an IT workload or app versus a network function. There is different characteristics that make a network function to be what it is, but in essence, there shouldn't be a difference. From a Kubernetes point of view, it's the same. There are a set of parameters that make it unique, but in essence, the core is the same.
Agree.
But
I'm actually, yeah.
That's now a bit of that goes to a completely different discussion. So let's not go there. But for example, let's discuss further on inheritance. Why I brought up this case. So because we already went to NF, right? So which is already a certain bias we have. We decided not to go. Initially, we went for AMF, UPF, and SMF, and we decided to remove that specificity and go to a more generalized name, which is NF, right? So that's kind of an example of what we have been doing so far. And the question is, and that is also true, for example, I mean, we had this debate, for example, with cluster, right? I think in some discussion in the ORAN discussion where I was in, they wanted to build an ORAN specific profile. And I was against that because I said, for me, a cluster, whether it's an ORAN one, it's the attributes that make it ORAN specific, but I don't want to call it ORAN cluster. You see? So it's in the same vein. So I'm more of the in the modeling so far. Okay, my philosophy has been so far to build a cluster is a cluster, whether you use it for core or ORAN or for IT workloads, it's still a cluster. And what makes the cluster ORAN specific, it's probably you need a real-time kernel and you need these infra stuff and you need this and that and that and that. So it's the attributes of the cluster that make it ORAN or make it specific towards the implementation. But that is a philosophy. So we can go for other philosophies or other approaches, which will lead you towards another implementation. You see?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then in that case, then if we specified something like clusters and workload deployments or whatever you want to call them, then in the ORAN context, ORAN can say to deploy an ORAN compliant workload into an ORAN compliant cluster, you need to create models that look like X, Y, Z, A, B, C that are compliant with the NFIO upstream models. Something along those lines. So specialization towards being an NF deployment or whatever is actually done in the ORAN context.
See, yeah, so to give you another example why we went for maximum so far we have gone for maximum flexibility, which means it makes it less, I could make it less understandable, and I don't know, right? Because we are biased, or I'm at least biased to a certain extent. So for example, let's take now an SMF, right? Or take a core or even any application that we have, right? we decided, okay, we have one container, which is NF deployment. And let's say for cluster, we have the same. But then we say, okay, to make it OpenShift or Google Cloud or Wind River or something like that, they all can basically put their own KRM pieces in a package that makes it unique for their environment, right? And we did the same for SMF, and we did the same for UPF, and we did the same for the radio side. That's how generic we are at the moment. Now, I can understand that for certain people, this is very abstract, right? Because you almost can do, at the moment, we can do almost anything with what we have today. But I can understand Tal's point that he made is that to certain people that are designing in a specific environment and have a specific philosophy, that it's hard to understand. And maybe the first thing that we have to do is write it down to say, okay, that is the philosophy or that's the concept behind our current models, and see what people think about it, right? That's probably a good way to start, because then we can get some feedback around the current trajectory we are in. And that doesn't mean that we have to stay there, right? We can change.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes sense.
Because in my view, what we should, or at least my understanding of the modeling workgroup is, we have gone, first of all, we decided, okay, let's document what we have done, right? That's one thing, but maybe we should also document why we have done this, right? And then reflect upon it, and by writing it down, it means that people can comment and see the reasoning behind. And maybe some people disagree, and then we can discuss, right, and see how we evolve. But that would probably help, right? And I think these examples also help, right, that we just were discussing, right? I can help write some text, Kieran.
Yeah, I have a commit I want to, a pull request I want to submit, so that's where I've been gathering at least some of that text, so that would be a good place to collaborate, I think.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, like the whole philosophy behind NF deployment versus SMF and AMF, I think there are some slides that we even did at the time when we were debating. So I can dig them up and put some text around it, and then we can, because it's good that we capture it such that for people who are not directly involved, that they understand a little bit the current approaches. And we have changed, by the way, as well, right? So we have changed from specific SMF, AMF, UPF towards NF. Right?
Yep.
But that doesn't mean everybody agrees with that necessarily, but
okay, it's a good discussion. I'll ping something to you early next week, Wim, just to show you where I'm at and what I'm thinking. Maybe, yeah, I'm thinking we probably need to workshop some of this again. And then what I can try and do is put this into a presentation in terms of distilling out the key questions. We can discuss it again next week. So maybe we can spend a half hour talking about the stuff that we have now, and hopefully have something to present on that at that stage, and then spend another half hour going over this discussion again with a bit more focus on the specific questions that we need to address and where we go to get the answers.
right.
Any last thoughts? Okay, I think that was good. Thank you very much. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just for information, that's not technical at all, but be aware that next Friday is a holiday in certain countries. So,
including
not
my
every-
own. I forget about that.
Easter
No,
Friday.
doesn't mean that we need to change, because we cannot accommodate for the every country's holiday, etc. But some people may not be available. I won't be available, for instance.
Okay, I'll think about that and maybe put some options up on the Slack channel once I've got some material to share. Okay. If there's nothing else, then thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, Kieran. Good stuff.
Cheers.